tell me about where you grew up and what role, say, beauty in architecture or design played in your childhood as you were growing up.
Yeah, look, I grew up in the UAE, right? So I'm Indian. I've never lived in India. So it was kind of always that third culture kid, do I really fit
Yeah.
in? And when you're a child, it's interesting the things that you notice. And that question about beauty in architecture is very important because I remember I had a little window. My first memory of architecture is having a little window in my bedroom and just staring out at the clouds and watching them move and create these different formations. And I thought, wow, that's so beautiful. Or the way the light would sometimes hit the floor surface, right? Those were kind of my first interactions with architecture and beauty, and they were very early on. I remember being 6 or 7 and having these vivid experiences.
Wow. Did they draw you to want to be an architect or a designer? I mean, so we met each other in school and like were you aspiring to a career in design at that point?
They always say that in an Indian family, you kind of have to live out your parents' dreams. So my father always
Uh-huh.
wanted to be an architect, right? And he
Wow.
ended up being a contractor. And as a child, obviously, he got me all the right toys. Lego was a huge feature in our house. There was all the mechano stuff, right? Where you would kind of screw together stuff and build it. So that whole building and creating stuff, he was an artist as well. So I used to when all the other kids were out there playing on Fridays, which was our weekend back then, I was in art class. So I think he kind of put that into
Yeah.
my head, ingrained it into my DNA maybe very early on. So I never thought I'd be an architect, but I knew it had to be a creative pursuit.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And then so how did you then end up pursuing a career in design? What led to that?
So I actually started university as a visual communications or a graphic design major.
Hmm.
And I remember in foundation year, they throw everyone together and they're like, oh, this is a great social experiment. Let's see what happens. And I remember all my work, instead of being two-dimensional, was three-dimensional. So the professors were like, hang on a second, I think you need to switch majors. And I was like, no, never.
Huh.
My father wants me to be an architect. No way. I'm going to be a graphic designer and rebel. Um, but as fate would have it, there were so many mentors pushing me into this direction. And I would say they influenced that choice. And I have
Hmm.
never looked back since because three-dimensional form really is kind of, I think, what I was born to do in many ways.
Huh. Are there any exemplars of beautiful architecture or beautiful design that really struck you as a child that sort of, captivated your imagination and maybe even shaped the kind of work you do?
Yeah, I just remember going into religious spaces, right? We grew up very secular. So going into either a mosque or a temple or a church. And I remember sort of that scale and the impact
Hmm.
that it had on people. People would just immediately become respectful, become introspective,
Hmm.
become quiet. And I was like, wow, there's a three-dimensional space that is influencing behavior, or it gives you that sense of wow, something is there. It
Hmm.
either evokes spirituality through its scale, it evokes reverence through its form.
Yeah.
And I think as a child, those were kind of my first memories of architecture influencing behavior.
Okay. Are there ways in which you build in some of those kinds of principles into the work you do?
Absolutely. I mean, with the work that we do, it's very empathy based, it's very user experience driven. So I always kind of journey my user through the space. And I think, oh, when that person turns this corner, what is it that they see? What can make them pause? What can make them reflect? Or what can
Yeah.
speed up that journey, right? So I'm constantly thinking about how they traverse through that space and how I can very subtly kind of influence that. I always say that
Hmm.
architects are a little bit like bullies. They
Hmm.
make you they're puppeteers. They make you perform through a space.
Aha.
Think about walking through an airport, how a
Right.
travelator slows you down or speeds you up. And I've always been fascinated by that.
Wow. Great. Great. Well, talk about some of the work you've done and what you might consider striving for beauty or examples of beauty that you try to create and generate in your work.
See, for me, it's always beauty is not just something that pleases your eyes. It has to
Hmm.
evoke and kind of engage all five senses. And I find
Hmm.
that when something is truly beautiful, it does that. It engages
Hmm.
all five of your senses and it stays with you as a memory, as in a sense, much longer after that moment. So in my work, that's what I try to do. I don't just think about creating aesthetically pleasing spaces. I think about creating spaces that engage, like, that are tactile. So it engages your sense of touch. I think of spaces of
Mm.
how to incorporate natural elements so that it can stimulate kind of your nasal glands as well. So it's about engaging those five senses and just always being true to the user experience. I think that is the key.
Great. You had a symposium that you were at a couple of months ago. You talked about a tension between form and function, and then that was something that you've encountered in your work. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how that relates to this concept of beauty?
Yeah, look, when you are an architect, I think it's your responsibility to do both, right? Your space
Mm.
has to be functional and it has to be poetic to look at. And I think, when I was a young architect, I was like, yeah, of course, I can have both. But I think now, 20 years on, I realize for those completely out of the box, creative, innovative, poetic spaces, sometimes function is compromised. And how is it compromised? It's either compromised through the economics, because those spaces are very beautiful. My favorite architect, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid. People look at the architecture from the outside and they're like, wow, stunning. And I do too. But there are some unusable spaces on the inside. They are challenging projects to
Mm.
build structurally. So I think, when you are pursuing true beauty, which can really have that sense of, wow, takes my breath away. Maybe sometimes you have to compromise function. And I think I'm starting to float in that gray area now. I'm not thinking of things as black and white.
Right, right, right. So how do you make that decision as to when to compromise form and when to compromise function?
In my work, I try and always prioritize function, right? Because form, you
Okay.
look at form for like 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Uh-huh.
We spend 89% of our time inside, experiencing
Yeah.
the space, right? So I will always create some aha or wow moments. But for me in my work, I would say it's still 90% function and 10% form. And sometimes the form results from the function. So I'm not saying that the 90% is
Hmm.
boring or uninviting visually. I'm just saying that it's not perhaps as poetic as the work of Zaha Hadid or Frank Gehry, all of my idols, Thomas Heatherwick, because
Right.
sometimes I have to think about the economics, and
Yeah.
my client's budget.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And you don't want something that looks great but doesn't actually work for their purpose, right? So
Absolutely.
the other tension that had come up in our conversation was around perfection and imperfection, let's say, right? Because a lot of people associate beauty with that kind of ideal, and you're talking about, the ideal of those sort of exemplary architects. But there's also, I think you pointed to the beauty of brokenness, things like wabi sabi, and tell us more about that kind of tension in your work. And do you ever find yourself in some way valorizing imperfection or highlighting it?
Absolutely. I think as humans, we are flawed, right? So anything that I create is going to be flawed. My biggest inspiration is nature. There's not a
Mm.
single straight line in nature. Okay. So people think of perfection as we got to get these clean, straight lines. Everything has to be, super symmetrical. Yes, nature has symmetry, but it's slightly imbalanced, kind of like my face. It's slightly imbalanced. But I think from that imperfection is where a conversation can start. When I look at a
Mm.
rough surface, an unhoned, fractured kind of marble, sometimes I put that and celebrate it on a reception desk where someone else might chase like that perfect piece of marble. But I think, oh my God, this marble's had a life. It's come from a quarry. It's traveled a long way. No one's going to use it. That's not right. So for me, you have to celebrate that imperfection because it also reminds you that you can take the pressure off yourself and allow your flaws to shine. And I think it's
Mm.
one of, is it Rumi's quotes? I don't know who wrote it, but it's, when you're broken, the light shines through. And I love that. I love that saying about imperfection.
Mm.
So I celebrate it in my work. I don't always have the glitzy, shiny things. Sometimes I put broken tiles in my work just so that it celebrates the journey of the project.
Wow, wow, great. You sent us a few images. Now, this our listeners won't be able to see this unless they go onto our YouTube channel. But could you talk us through to those images and what it was that you found striking or important about them?
Yeah, I send you a lot of work in progress images, right? I send you images of one of our team members, a construction team member, laying down the carpet. Now, everybody looks at that as such a useless task. But for me, he was sitting there for hours, making sure all the patterns would align because I'm so OCD. I was like, please
Mm.
just make sure all the patterns align in one certain direction. So he was carefully checking out the direction and laying it down. And I found that so beautiful, like that joy and that pride that he was taking in the work and also honoring my feelings. So that's one of the images I sent you. And the others are just me at a workshop or me on site. For me, beauty is almost that process of iteration. I think that's where beauty comes in from. It comes through those hours that you spend honing and crafting, and not just the finished product or the project. It's that iterative process. So those are kind of the images. That's what they speak to. For me, beauty is an iterative process. It's a work in progress, much like us as humans. We're always
Yeah.
trying to evolve, develop, better ourselves. So that's kind of where I was
Yeah.
at with
Yeah.
those images.
Yeah, no, this that's really I think that's really important to think about. When I talk to scientists who I've studied a lot about the role of beauty in science, this sort of iterative nature of the scientific quest is really something that everyone talks about, but not as a space where they find beauty. For a lot of them, that's where the ugliness and messiness and frustration comes in. And that for a lot of people is, having to deal with failure when something doesn't quite go the way you want it to, or dealing with the unexpected. Talk more about the process. I mean, what is that experience like for you, and what does it look like, and where exactly is the beauty in that? But is there also pain? Is there also suffering? Is there also ugliness?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would say pain and ugliness is the flip side of beauty, right? So you can't have one without the other. They're two sides of the coin. And I think you can only appreciate beauty of the end result by going through the pain and suffering. You nailed it, right? Frustration. Of course, through any creative process, right? You're putting a piece of you out there. So you're being so vulnerable. Now, sometimes your ideas, you try and test them and they don't work. And you got to restart and you got to rethink, or you have to convince someone and sell your idea. So that process is very painful and it's quite emotionally exhausting because it's so much of you that's gone into this work. But at the same time, like I said, you can't have one without the other. I think they balance
Mm.
each other out. You can't have perfection without appreciating imperfection, and you can't have beauty without going through the pain of the process. So for me, the process is just integral to the design.
Mm.
Everybody's like, oh, let's just get to the finish line. And I'm like, no, there's no way you're going to learn anything by just getting to the finish line. Or you won't even appreciate the finish line if you don't appreciate this present moment and the process that we're in right now.
Yeah. Do you have a memory of any one particular project where the process really stood out to you as sort of a place where you encountered something beautiful, right? Anything that where you could walk us through that journey and show us a little bit of where the beauty was?
Yeah, look, we were designing a spa. I think you spoke about it in the Kempinski Hotel. And I wanted,
Mm.
in my head, I was stuck on this vision, these gigantic arches that create an internal courtyard that lead into the spa rooms. Now, that was a nightmare to construct. They constructed it, and the contractor actually got the dimensions wrong. So the base of those arches ended up in the middle of a doorway to the rooms themselves, and they had to be off to the
Yikes.
side so people could actually walk into the room. And I was like, oh my God, there's no way I can waste so much steel. We can't lose project time on this, right? But it was working on site and finding a solution. And what I found beautiful is like the structural engineer was there. Me as a designer was there. We had the mechanical engineer because obviously we had air conditioning and all sorts of stuff in the ceiling as well. So working together and through the varied experience and expertise of so many different individuals, we came up with a solution and we salvaged that problem rather than being like, oh God. And I found that very beautiful. That art of collaboration, of
Mm.
human collaboration and human expertise coming together to resolve something, that's magic.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. There's a another I mean important challenge I suppose that for a lot of people in trying to particularly do design is to convey this principle of what our friend Anjan Chatterjee calls homeyness. I mean this idea of being able to feel at home. That's one of the sort of key principles for hospitality in any kind of space. How do you convey that? What does that mean to help people feel at home either in a hotel or in a restaurant or in any of the even an office? Like how do you do that?
I think the most important thing is always going back to my basic principle, which is engaging the five senses and working through empathy. Okay. So
Mm.
that's the core of any space that we design. whether it's a hospital, whether it's an office, whether it's a hotel. Okay. So if you start from that point, which is empathy driven, understanding what the user needs are, what the user experience is, and how to engage them, you can't ever go wrong. This idea of homeyness or feeling the sense of calm or sanctuary is very important in the space. So I go back to the evidence-based design where you
Mhm.
spend 89% of your time indoors. So you really have to have this sense of calmness when you're in the space. Now, a lot of people design these perfect institutional spaces that are show homes, but you just never feel comfortable because you feel like if I put my feet up on the coffee
Yeah.
table, someone's going to, a robot's going to come and eject me out of my seat or
Right,
something.
right, right.
And that's where the imperfection comes in. We just recently designed a wellness center. So people go in for rehab therapy, for psychiatric treatments. And
Mm.
one of the big things the psychologist was telling me, please don't design a perfect space. It has to be
Mm.
imperfect. It has to be rough around the edges so that people can feel like who they are, flawed. So I think
Mm.
those homey
Mm.
spaces
Mm.
also have to have that a sense of imperfection so people can feel at rest. And
Yeah.
besides that, adding biophilic elements, natural tones, neutral backgrounds, reducing the visual noise, all of these are other tricks that we use to convey that.
Great, great. Beauty at Work is brought to you by Templeton Religion Trust. If you enjoyed this clip, go check out the full episode. And please take a moment to subscribe and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks, and see you next time.